Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled, Are Sensors and Wearables Really the Future of Data Capture in Clinical Trials? Today's webinar my name is Aisha Rashid, and I will be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we will try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator from Avio Health today, Leslie Pascoe. Leslie Pascoe, who is currently Chief Marketing Officer at Avio Health, spent over 30 years stewarding Fortune 100 companies in the development of purpose-driven innovation strategies, from consumer health and wellness leaders Procter & Gamble, Nestle, and Unilever to Google and AT&T. Leslie volunteers as an active board member for Triggeries, a paradigm-shifting digital health NGO, leveraging a pioneering data platform to deliver sexual reproductive health services to sub-Saharan African youth. She is a passionate evangelist for digital technologies that can improve health outcomes. And now, without further ado, I'd like to pass over the mic to Leslie, who will lead us into our webinar today.
Thank you, Aisha, and good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here to moderate this esteemed panel, who I will introduce shortly, to discuss sensors and wearables, which is quite the hot topic in the clinical trial space at the moment, which is why we're so glad to have all of you here. First, a brief word about Avio Health. We're sponsoring this webinar. Avio Health is a virtual research organization, or what we've dubbed a VRO, that designs and runs end-to-end clinical trials. We do this by adapting traditional protocols to incorporate digital outcomes and endpoints, and then developing innovative study designs to run on the Avio Go platform and app, making it easy for patients to participate. The clinical trial experience is thus optimized at every touch point, which leads to higher compliance and completion rates, and ultimately is delivering stronger evidence to our sponsors. Avio Health has been ranked for the past 3 years on Inc.'s 5,000 list of fastest growing companies, and this year we're ranking 16th in the health sector. Okay, so moving on to our esteemed panelists. I'd like to start by introducing Florence Molam. Florence is an expert eCOA scientist who has spent her career advising and guiding clinical research organizations, including Medable and Signant Health, on the digitization and remote capture of clinical outcome assessments and the use of connected health devices in clinical trials. Dr. Molam holds a PhD in social, genetic, and developmental psychiatry from King's College, which has informed her work on the scientific practice of digital endpoint capture. In her pivotal role at Avio Health, Dr. Molam works with both clinical and technology teams to optimize the implementation of eCOAs according to industry, regulatory, and scientific best practice. And welcome to Flo. Next, we have Helen Shaw, co-founder and director of VCTC, a patient-centric clinical trial site dedicated to bringing clinical research directly to participants through compassionate and expedited site processes. Dr. Shaw holds a PhD in philosophy with a focus on clinical trial methodologies from the University of Birmingham, where she developed early considerations for the use of e-consent in clinical trials. And during her more than 15 years serving in the industry as a rare disease patient herself, Dr. Shaw has advocated for the development and implementation of strategies that make clinical research more accessible and less burdensome for participants. So glad to have you, Helen. Finally, but certainly not least, Ryan Kennedy has 22 years of experience leading tech innovation in the clinical research industry, specializing in patient engagement and the development of high-value healthcare software solutions. Following his work in direct patient recruitment and trial oversight at the Hillman's Cancer Center, Ryan transitioned into technology development, leading eCOA product teams at ERT, now Clario, and serving as a head of product for Thread Research. Now at Oracle, Ryan manages the creation of next-generation cloud solutions designed to enhance patient centricity for the life science and healthcare industries. Greetings, Ryan. All right, now that you're all introduced, we're quite excited for this discussion. Before we dive right in, I want to share some data that can help to contextualize the state of play in sensors and wearables, and we're just going to share 4 data points with you. The first is that as of 2022, almost half of consumers are tracking their health data with wearable devices. Secondly, according to clinicaltrials.gov, as of September of this year, there are more than 4,500 trials that mention the use of sensors and wearables. The global wearable sensors market is projected to surpass approximately $4.4 billion by 2032, and significant growth over those 10 years. And lastly, shipments of medical wearables and sensors devices are forecast to increase to 160 million units by 2024. Okay, so I want to introduce the first question here. And we can see this data, we can see that there's a trend toward greater use of sensors and wearables in life and in trials. So I'd like to ask the panelists, if you could go back to the preceding slide, please, Aisha. I'd like to ask the panelists, why now? Why are we seeing this trend? And Flo, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Leslie. I think they're offering a real opportunity to be able to collect more objective data about how participants are functioning in their everyday life. And I think the opportunity to capture more real-time data. So instead of just collecting data at site visits, we're able to get more granular data in between those visits and about how they're actually functioning in their everyday lives. And I think that offers a great opportunity to really understand more about how patients are functioning and to understand more about their health status and the impact that treatments are having on them in their daily lives. And there's also the opportunity, because they can be very passive in nature, that they reduce the burden on participants. And we know that participants in clinical trials are often quite unwell. So we're very focused on ways that we can really optimize data capture in clinical trials while also reducing the burden on participants for their participation. And so I think that is very much why we're really seeing this drive towards really thinking about how we can include them in clinical trials going forward.
Thanks, Flo. Helen, I know your eyes always light up whenever we say reducing the patient burden. So did you want to chime in?
Just to agree with everything that Florence has said, really. I think the key there is that patients attending clinical trial visits every month, every week, whenever it is, it doesn't reflect their entire lives. You know, it's a clinical environment, it's outside of the real world, essentially, in that clinical trial environment. So I think there are 2 things about wearables and sensors. I think firstly, it allows us to capture data that we couldn't otherwise get. And it also allows us to capture it in the patient's home environment. And I think that leads to the better evidence and better proving of efficacy of the products being tested. So I think it has a great potential to improve the way that we collect data on clinical trials.
Thank you. And Ryan, why do you think we're seeing this uptick now in the use of sensors and wearables, particularly in clinical trials?
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks everyone for attending. Great question. When you look at what the pandemic released on the clinical trial space and healthcare in general, it really opened up opportunity for the industry to reevaluate how to collect data on patients. Similar to the co-industry when it was starting, you know, we were doing studies back in the late 90s, early 2000s on whether or not paper was equivalent to a device. And there were a lot of debates about whether, you needed a 10 millimeter line. It was really 10 millimeters long. And obviously we've gotten to the point where screen size matters little. We understand how to adopt and use varying devices. I see a similar trend in devices. The cat's out of the bag from the pandemic. We just need to kind of figure out how to best apply and use those technologies to further the research.
Thank you. So those are some of the reasons that we're seeing this trend. We know that sensors and wearables are not going to fit every situation. So for the people out in the audience who are trying to think about the appropriate use of sensors and wearables, when should sponsors and study teams consider incorporating sensors and wearables into their study designs? Thoughts from anyone?
Yeah, so from a patient's point of view, Leslie, I think it's about how we can use them to reduce the burden on patients. So, where can we use sensors and wearables to reduce the number of clinic visits? We shouldn't just be doing things from home, I think, for the sake of doing them at home. We should really be considering when it's the best thing to do for the study and the patient. So looking at actually when the patients do need to go on site for assessments, doing everything that we need to do on site at that visit. For example, if we were doing a diabetes study, you're going to look at blood glucose maybe on site, but you're also going to want to look at things at home as well. And as I say, it's about collecting those additional data points in the home environment. So, what could you add to that study that would reduce the number of clinic visits? Could you add in a wearable? Could you add in some home sensors that allow the patients to reduce the number of hospital visits that they have? Whilst bearing in mind that there's got to be a balance. You can't send patients homes with 5 different sensors and wearables. You can't have them leaving the hospital with a huge box of equipment to take home. And so we really have to look, it happens, I tell you. So we really have to look at what it means for the patients to have these sensors and wearables on the study right from the start, and really the impact of that. And then the second thing I wanted to add is that we should be looking at it to measure those really important outcomes as well. So there are some sensors that we take for granted now. We do glucometers at home for diabetes trials. No one would do a diabetes trial without the finger prick testing, but that wasn't mainstream at one point. That was developed for use and is now mainstream. So I think there's also the side where we need to include these things into studies to be able to have them mainstream and to get the data that we need to allow them to be used in clinical trials.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. Ryan, what about your thoughts on this?
Yeah,
When
Helen.
does it make sense?
Helen, that was the great point you made there at the end. When you kind of look at how to improve the data fabric that allows you to get a better picture of the patient, having a glucometer at home really simplifies the data collection. Regulators recently, we all wish it was sooner. They were in the ECOA industry, but within the past decade have said that they want it on every study. It'll vastly improve your chances of approval to get the perspective of the patient. One thing that ECOA doesn't offer that sensors and wearables do are a better sense of the patient's actual behavior, or in your example, their blood levels. If you think of kind of a pain study or a mobility study, you could ask them a question every day that says, how are they doing? How far are you walking? How do you feel, etc. And they'll answer it, and most likely they'll answer it based on how they feel at the moment, not necessarily how they felt throughout the day. And if you attach that endpoint with a, activity meter, and you could see that they started the trial with a pain level of 6 or 7, and they were moving a mile a day. And in a month, they're still at a pain threshold of 6 or 7, but they're moving 4 or 5 miles a day. The resulting improvement is significant, but if you just had the ECOA, you would still be sitting at the same pain level.
That's super interesting. You're getting, you could say, complementary or contradictory information, but both of those pieces of information are important and valuable.
Correct.
Yeah, thank you. Flo.
So I think the importance of including wearables and sensors, or when should we be including them, I think is going to what Helen said, is when it makes sense. I think too often we see clinical trials or sponsors running clinical trials trying to really throw in technology for the sake of it at times, and we have to think about all of the stakeholders involved, so participants and sites, and how they're going to deal with all of that. I think what is really important is your trial design. So start with the end in mind. What is your endpoint strategy? What is it you want to be measuring? What is it you think that your intervention is going to impact? What data do you need to collect to support that? And would a sensor or wearable facilitate that? And if yes, then really think about how you're going to incorporate that in a really streamlined, seamless way, and all of the people who are going to have to work with the implementation and the data that's coming out of it. So the participants, the sites, I think that's what's important, and it's not going to be relevant in every example, in every trial that you've got. But I think really thinking about whether the data is going to help you with your endpoint strategy is important.
Thank you. Just kind of a naive question about that. You said to start with the end in mind. Wouldn't every trial necessarily start with the end in mind? How does that get missed?
I think you'd be surprised in the clinical trial industry how much it does. I think, and this maybe goes to the point of Ryan talking about the inclusion of patient-reported outcome measures in clinical trials. Like, we've only just really seen them starting to take place as primary or secondary endpoints. And who really knows better about the disease or the condition than the participant themselves? And understanding the value and benefit or the risk or the side effects, more a better understanding of that from the actual participants' experience, I think is vital. And we're only just starting to see that. I think we're very used to the endpoints coming just from clinicians or from objective tests, and I think we're missing out on some key information. And so I think we're definitely getting there. We're starting to think about really what is your treatment going to impact, but I think we still see that it gets forgotten.
Right. Any other particularly good moments to consider sensors and wearables in a trial besides those you just mentioned?
Can I just add to that as well, to what Flo just talked about, is you don't, and it's links into what Ryan said earlier about the pain measurements as well. You don't know what you don't know, and when you test in a new drug, you don't know what impact it's going to have. So measuring a selection of endpoints is great, but so you just don't know what you've got until you do it. And I think by including endpoints that patients can measure themselves at home, you get two benefits from that potentially, if done right. You get additional data for the study, but you also get the patients involved in a potential feedback loop. If they're collecting data themselves at home, they might be invested more in the trial, they might be invested more in how the impact that it's having on them. But of course, then that comes with considerations about bias. If they're seeing their a particular measurement that they want to see go up or down, will that influence the responses that they're giving to the PROs, or is it going to bias them? Are they going to assume they're in a placebo arm or a treatment arm based on the results that they're seeing in a wearable? So I think there are those considerations as well.
Right. So it is great for engagement, but it needs to be used with caution to make sure that it's not creating any sort of biasing effect of the patients. Helen, you said earlier, like, nobody would ever do a study without a glucometer, but there was a time when they didn't use a glucometer in a study. And so, I mean, there seems, we don't have that many sensors and wearables that people are aware of, so how do you get to the point where you are putting these devices, measurements as endpoints into studies? Anyone?
I mean, I'll take a shot at it. I think something that we've seen in the last decade or so has been a somewhat of a tech revolution when it comes to sensors and wearables. I mean, a couple of things. The population that has lived with technology is growing. and the population that is aging into an area that may have tech hesitancy or tech confusion has grown up with tech. I mean, just literally a couple weeks ago, my mom broke her Apple Watch. She ordered a new one. It showed up. I got a phone call. I was expecting to have to do some sort of tutorial on how to get it to sync, and she did it all herself, and it all worked. And her watch was, and she was, and it, you know, I mean, she's in her mid 70s, and that was not a thing that was conceivable to, you know, our grandparents' age 10 years ago. Like, if you handed them a digital watch, they have no idea what to do with it. I think the capabilities and the comfort that people are having with these technologies are only growing by the day, and it provides a much more significant opportunity for us to evaluate how these endpoints can be measured without having to worry so much about the individuals using them not understanding how they work.
Right. So if sensors and wearables have all this potential, then why, in fact, aren't more sponsors using them in what are the roadblocks? What's getting in the way?
I mean, from my perspective, I think the big one is med device versus consumer wearables. You know, to my previous example, there's a much higher uptake of consumer wearables, but the med device 510K approvals, they're not really coupling that with specific endpoints when it comes to activity meters or, you know, any sort of movement device. Obviously, the glucometer example that we keep going back to that Helen brought up, I mean, that one's fairly straightforward. That is an endpoint. If you have an approved device that measures, you know, calibrated glucose level, then that's an easy endpoint. So, you know, I think there's an opportunity to start coupling the device measurement with an algorithm that can be associated to consumer wearables that could turn the resulting endpoint into an approved, you know, medical device. I just think right now the consumer bent on the consumer devices is still more towards, you know, your regular consumer and not towards research.
Right. Can you just break that down a little bit further for us? I know when we spoke earlier, you were talking about some of these black box algorithms and how that's getting in the way of use in trials.
So when I talk to our customers, they struggle a lot with Apple or Fitbit or whoever updating their algorithms for the consumer. So how it measures a step or how it measures distance traveled is always being tweaked. If the watch updates its algorithm, then the measurement or endpoint that you were using on the study potentially could change. So the sponsors are really trying to get access to the raw data coming off of the instruments, and not so much the little data that shows up on your screen when you see how many steps you've done or how far you've walked that day.
I think yeah, I think that's a really important point. If we think about the patient-reported outcome measure industry and how much validation and development work goes into ensuring that that measure measures exactly what it's supposed to measure, it's a meaningful aspect of health to participants, and that you can be confident of using it in your clinical trials when you want to use it as an endpoint to show efficacy or safety, and that the regulators will be confident in the data that's coming from that measure. And when the measure's developed, it also comes, so when you license it, it comes with the scoring. So the regulators and anyone using it can be really confident that it's being used in the same way and the scoring is being done in the same way across trials. There's that standardization. And I think at the moment we're not there with wearables. If we think about activity monitors, the algorithms are proprietary. So we're not seeing the same transparency and openness as we do with ePro scoring. And I think that is something that we need to think of as an industry about how we're going to overcome that and how we're going to deal with that. And especially, as Ryan said, if it is going to be tweaked or changing, how we maintain confidence in the data and how we've then created that endpoint from that data, I think is going to be so important. Otherwise, we're going to end up with every single trial using a slightly different variation of the data, and is that then essentially a slightly different endpoint?
Yeah, Helen, any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah. And I think when you add to that as well, the additional complication then of bringing your own device along, because there are a big group of patients, particularly younger patients, that have their own Apple Watch. They've got their own watches that they use already. You know,
Ryan's mother,
myself,
don't forget Ryan's mother.
Ryan's mother, yeah, absolutely. She's got the watch that she likes already. But people don't want to wear, you know, they want to wear the watch that they're wearing for whatever reason. You know, for me, I track my health because I get points for my medical insurance. So I would want to still wear my own watch. People don't want to wear two watches. You know, when you talk about mobile phones for trials and the ePro devices, people are okay with two mobile phones, but watches, they're just not going to do that. So you've got that consideration as well, is actually on top of all of the thoughts around the comparability of the data, how do we then bring that into a place where patients can use the devices they're already wearing if they so wish? So I think that's an additional complexity to add into the mix.
Thank you. So we've got some hurdles with consumer wearables that will need to get addressed. But I want to come back just for a moment to the med device side of things that that a couple of you brought up. So med devices is a little bit easier. I guess I would then ask the question on the med device side, why aren't more sponsors incorporating them into their trials?
I think there's also the element of, I think we're talking about sensors and wearables today, and I think you can split those apart as well. So I think there's many sensors and potentially wearables that are collecting. So if we think about blood pressure monitor or weight scales or glucometers, they're collecting data that those devices, there's a gold standard to measure them against. So that in-clinic gold standard, and we can then look at the data that comes from those types of devices when they're used in the home environment and understand how reliable they are and how they compare to those gold standards. And I think whereas with wearables, maybe that like activity monitors or something that's measuring sleep, we don't necessarily have that gold standard to measure against, or what we are comparing it against is maybe not ideal. The reason we're using those wearable devices is because we think they can capture better data that will be more valuable. So what do we compare them against if we're not happy with what the comparison would be? So I really think those are lots of challenges we need to also consider.
And how do we get to those gold standards for the things where they don't exist?
That's a very good question. I think we probably all need to come together in a very collaborative way to think about that. I think like the regulators have a very important voice in that as well, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to be reviewing all of that data and deciding if they're convinced that it captures what you're saying it's capturing, and that then can be used in the decision for a new treatment. So I think that, yeah, I don't think there's a straightforward answer to that one.
I mean, Flo, to your point with the regulators, I think it's really important. If you're going to start shipping the large box of technology home that Helen referenced earlier with the patients, you're going to want to be sure that the cost of putting that box together and sending it home to the patient is going to be worth the expense for the trial. The cuff that you brought up, Flo, you know, I mean, in a clinic, it is completely expected, and the regulators will agree that you've evaluated patient, that they're not stressed, that they're at a resting heart rate or whatever the situation is required to measure what they're going to get out of that cuff. At home, you know, they may get an alert that says it's time to do the cuff. They may be in the middle of a workout. They may be chasing some kids around. They throw it on, they get a result, and that doesn't diminish the value that the result is coming from the cuff or the kind of viability of its measurement, but the conditions of which it's being used become wildly varied when you send it home. And I think the regulators are going to have to wrestle with a flexibility or maybe a frequency that they run them, that you run an average on. But the industry is kind of struggling with how you create that standard environment in a wildly changing home environment.
Thank you, Ryan. I mean, as the representative of Oracle, I want to just ask you about, like, what about all this data? Imagine that these, you know, maybe not the 5 sensors and wearables that Helen has referred to, but let's bring it down to 2. there's a lot of data that can be collected either continuously or quite frequently. What are some of the challenges with managing that data once it comes into the system?
So, I mean, I think, and we're still wrestling with this in ECOA, but you know, it was mentioned earlier in the discussion that you know the size of the tumor or the reduction in some sort of disease metric has been traditionally how we measure success in a trial. When you start adding in, you know, 2 decades ago in the ECOA system, you weren't coupling the two. So, you know, they still their cancer markers are decreasing. Their pain may be the same, their quality of life may be the same, maybe getting worse. There wasn't kind of a correlation until after the study. So there was no intervention occurring during the study to kind of mitigate some of those side effects that maybe occur. Wearables create an even greater data challenge. There is such a mountain of data that can come in from these devices that if you aren't really, if you're either measuring them every month or every quarter or at the end of the study, like you know the typical models are today, you are missing the ability to really see the signals that those devices are showing. So creating a safe and consistent data flow is going to be really important. That the security of bringing all the data into one place in near real time, so you can see it versus labs versus diagnostics versus ECOA versus the wearables. If you can't see that picture in real time at a large scale, it's going to be very challenging, and that's where Oracle is focusing. Like a lot of competitors and companies out there like yourselves are developing data points and large data sets for their specific role. But what sponsors really need to do to make sense of how to optimize that data is get it together as quickly as possible and not wait for the exhaust of the end of the study to kind of see what they collected and how to manage it.
Yeah, look at it in real time and be able to react in real time. That is quite a high bar. I want to come back to you, Helen, because I asked what some of the remaining challenges are associated with being able to get more sensors and wearables into trials. And I was wondering about the patient's perspective on all of that.
So I think in general, we massively overestimate how capable the general public are at using devices they don't know in their own home. And a very good example of that is I have had a home blood pressure monitor for a study, and I had to do it. I was given my instructions and I couldn't even turn it on. And I consider myself to be a relatively capable person. I'm used to seeing these things, but the instructions didn't tell me how to turn it on, and you had to press a couple of buttons simultaneously. And at that point, I was already stressed, fed up, couldn't even get this thing to work. It instantly puts you as a patient on the back burner. You don't want to sound silly by calling your nurse up and saying, I'm really sorry, I can't even get the device to turn on. And I think that's the reality of it, is often sensors, wearables, the patient facing side of these and the site training on these types of devices is often not done. We rush to get the trial set up, we rush to get everything out, and we don't give the proper instructions to the people that are at the end of the line using these. And if you don't train your sites properly, how can they train the patients? And I think that's for me one of the crux of the problems. And if you're looking at the points that Ryan's just been talking about around making sure that the sensor has the right cost and expense and everything else for the trial, to make sure that we are collecting the data in a consistent manner. If we're not training people and we're not even giving them the tools to do it themselves, how can we expect that we're collecting the data in the right way? So I think that's the biggest one of the biggest challenges that we see, is a lack of training and information around how to use these devices for the patients.
And that's absolutely,
please.
Well, I was just going to say, and that's so key, especially when we're going to think about decentralizing elements in clinical trials and removing them away from site. So participants no longer have that site personnel right next to them, guiding them through it. So training is so important, and also letting participants know that there's someone to reach out to if they do have concerns or issues. And they may not be going into site as regularly or at all, but they've still got that support there. And I think the site training is so important as well, not just in supporting the patients with device setup, but also how the sites are supposed to interact with that data. To go back to Ryan's point of all of this data coming in for the sponsor that they've got to think about at the end of their trial, but how do we want sites to deal with it throughout the trial? I mean, maybe we don't want them to be looking at it, because essentially that could give indications as to how a participant is functioning and could unblind the site to the treatment allocation or the group allocation. But if there's useful information that could be helping them interact or intervene in certain things with the participant, then we also need to think about how they're going to be dealing and interacting with that data, especially when you've got so much of it that is being collected continuously. Sites are already stretched as it is, so we just really need to think about what we expect from them and how we are going to support and train them to deal with this influx of data.
Right. So
yeah,
we.
I mean, Flo, to your.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Sorry.
Come on.
To your point there with the data at the end, looking at the end and the beginning, if you're going to bring all of this data in, you need some understanding of how you want to evaluate it as it's coming in. It's not fair to the patient to burden them with all of these complexities if you don't have a strategy. If it's just like, we'll figure out what it looks like at the end of the study. But today there are very few systems. I mean, ours is in development, so it's not even prime time, but that can bring all of this data together. I mean, we have a lot of it, Avio has a lot of it, but being able to run these new GPT technologies on the large data that's coming in with a goal in mind. Do we adjust the trial? Do we accelerate the schedule? Do we change the schedule? If you don't have those questions in mind as you're designing your study, it's just going to be a mountain of data at the end that you're being asked to make sense of.
And was there something you wanted to add?
So,
nothing more than mine's just added.
Okay.
So
Fantastic. All right. Thank you. So we've highlighted quite a few reasons that help to clarify what may be slowing down the adoption, even though we're seeing the trend that it could be even faster if we were able to address the consumer wearables algorithm issue, if we have clearer sense of, what the endpoints are, even for the med devices, if we address patient training and are sensitive to the patient's needs, if we're addressing the site's needs with training, and then we've got this whole data integration issue and how we're going to analyze the data. I thought it would be good prior to starting this webinar, we actually sent out a question to the attendees about what they thought the biggest challenge was to integration of sensors and wearables into trials. And so on the next page, Aisha, I know we gave a little tease, maybe some people saw it, but we got 100 people that fed back on this. And you've got the answers here. You had 36% of people that actually said they thought that device integration was the greatest challenge of actually bringing sensors and wearables into trials. And then that's followed by analysis, and then to a lesser degree, data privacy, device selection, site acceptance. Any reactions to this from the panel?
I think it's interesting to see that it's not heavily weighted towards one element. There's, people are recognizing a whole host of challenges into the successful incorporation. I think none of it really comes as a surprise. I think maybe I would say the device integration, I would have thought that would be the lowest out of them, but maybe that's because I work for a technology company where I understand more about that and how it can be done. But that's an education thing. Maybe we need to, as an industry, be more clear about how we do integrate devices, and whether we're talking about just the participant integrating the device into their, it's linked with their phone, because quite often they'll also be collecting, reporting on patient-reported outcome measures throughout the trial, or whether it's about the device integration and that data feeding into the all of the database with all of the other data. So I think, yeah, there's definitely things that we can do to help put people's mind at ease.
Any other reactions, or should I throw the next question at you? Off we go. No, Brian?
I'm happy to see that device data is higher on the list, but I really do think the integration strategy that you deploy is going to be a huge challenge. And if you don't have it thought through, you're going to have lots of complications at the sites, you know, dealing with, I gave them the device, but nothing's coming through. I don't see any of the data, or patients calling. And, you know, we're removing the goals of decentralized trials and sensors and wearables, which ostensibly are supposed to give more time for the patients, give sites more relief to manage the patients, and now we're adding tech support and integration complexities, and you know that's the opposite of the intention. But you know, if it's not thought through, it could very much be a big hurdle for that study.
That actually does lead directly into the next question. Thank you, Ryan, for the setup, which is, what are the tips for actually implementing sensors and wearables in trials? And maybe, I don't know if you want to just continue on that theme a little bit. How do you avoid those issues you just raised?
I would start with establishing kind of your clear parameters. So what are you actually looking to measure, and what is the least amount of data you need to achieve that? I think very much in research, there's been a pendulum that swings back and forth from let's collect as much as we possibly can, and then you realize that it's tremendously burdensome on either your statisticians or the patients or the sites, you know, or all three. You know, it depends, and then you kind of swing back. And sensors and wearables are really at the precipice of the biggest challenge, because the data that they can collect is tremendous. And if you don't have clear established goals and parameters, you are really going to get buried in complexities that the sites aren't going to recruit because it's too much of a headache. You can't decentralize many of the tasks because there's too much complexity involved in the technology. Patients don't want to deal with it. To Helen's story, you know, she's got a cuff that she needs to measure and her heart rate's shooting up because she can't figure out how to use it. You know, like these are not helpful things for the patients or the study.
Okay, so ladies, other tips for how to get this right?
I think it's all about planning. I think, and starting that plan as early as you can. To go to Ryan's point, more data doesn't just mean better, unless you know how you're going to use that data and what you're going to do with that data throughout the trial. I think ensuring that you're thinking about all of the stakeholders that are involved in a trial and how the use of technology is going to impact them throughout the trial process. Bringing vendors, all the different vendors that you're going to work with, as early as possible to help with that planning, rather than bringing them in at the end when, you know, they have really important insights and information from previous experience to really support sponsors in the setup of their trial. So I think it's all about the planning and doing it as early as possible and giving yourself enough time, because we all know that everything always ends up taking longer than you planned for.
No, I don't know what gives you that impression. Helen, other tips?
Yeah, so I've got two buckets really. The first one is asking your patients for input and review of your protocol. So when we ask our clients about this, you know, have you had patient input into your protocol design? And they say, yes, of course, we've had KOLs review it. That's not the same. You know, having experts in the industry review a protocol isn't the same as getting the patient's input themselves. If you're not going to have patient input, put yourself in the shoes of the patients, you know, really understand what it means to be in that trial. You've got these things to do. Actually, how long is that going to take the patient to get the sensor out, use it? How many times a day, a week are you going to be asking them to do this? Are the patients working? Are they are the patients in your study retired? Are they likely to be working? You know, these things make a difference to the types of activities that they're going to have the availability to do for your trial. So really considering the trial from the point of view of your patients. So that's the first thing. And then the other one is from the site perspective. So really making sure that the sites have got the infrastructure to support their patients, and that means both in their the people that they've got at the sites, you know, the budgets that you're providing to your sites. It does take time for us, our teams, to speak to patients, to train them on these devices, to talk to them on the day that they're doing their measurements, making sure everything's okay. You know, all of these pieces take time to do well. So it's making sure that you're enabling your sites to support the patients in your studies, and acknowledging that everyone learns in different ways. So what might work well for one patient won't necessarily work for another. So you've got to give your sites the tools to be able to train their patients. And that doesn't mean lots and lots of videos and manuals and everything like that. It might do, but it could also mean just letting your site teams actually experience it, letting them work their way through the system, giving them an opportunity to have a workshop at the investigators meeting where they can really try out these things. Just making sure that the people who are collecting the data for you, the patients and the sites, can succeed. And I think that they're two pieces that are, in my experience so far, hugely overlooked in trials.
Thanks, Helen. There was definitely a common theme across all three of you, which is planning and preparation in order to get this right. I do want to circle back to the title of this webinar, Are Sensors and Wearables the Future of Clinical Trials? That was the title. So I'd like to ask the three of you, are they?
I think so. I think doing things from home and opening up trials to people's everyday lives, particularly post-pandemic, you know, the world has changed. People expect flexibility. They expect not to have to travel for 4 hours for an appointment. All of these things that help patients access trials absolutely have to be incorporated in the future for me.
Yeah, I'd say yes as well. I think the pandemic maybe pushed us down the slide a little sooner than we were ready. But to the previous question, we need to clearly define for the regulators what's being measured and how we're measuring it. And at this point, we were forced to decentralize how we were doing healthcare in general, let alone research during the pandemic. So we accelerated what took a lot longer for ECOA or EPRO to go along with the pandemic, but we really need to take the time now to understand strategically how you want to deploy the devices, how you want to incorporate them into your studies, and most importantly, how you want to evaluate the data coming from them. Until those things are clear, I think the regulators are going to be hesitant to make strong stances one way or the other of how they should consume them when you submit.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're an industry that's all about evidence, and I think we need to provide the evidence that shows that they bring value. And I think we all have this feeling that they absolutely do, but we can't just assume it. We need to have that evidence that shows that they do bring value, and that then we can increase the adoption into more trials. And I think the way that we're going to have to do that is to collaborate. I think we quite often, in this case, operate in silos. You have the ECOA vendors, you have the sponsors, you have CROs, you have other companies that deal with all of this influx of data, you have the wearable device manufacturers. And I think we all need to come together to really think about how we show that value. Because at the end of the day, this is to enhance clinical trials and patients' health. So it's really important that we all collaborate.
It's a wonderful way to wrap that up before we get into the questions. Thank you. Thank you. So we wanted to save a little bit of time for questions. So there's one question that's at the top of the list, which is that there seems to be a fair amount of concern around data privacy. I know the number that we showed wasn't necessarily that high, but seemingly there is concern around this issue of data privacy with the use of sensors and wearables. So the question is that something, is that a real issue? Is it a problem?
I think if it's being brought up as a problem, then that's definitely something that, even if we don't feel that there are any concerns around it, there's an educational aspect to this to put people's mind at ease and to be really open and transparent with them about how the data is collecting, where being collected, what is being collected, where that data is going, who's seeing it. I think another interesting thing about wearables and sensors is who's that data coming from? So we know with when you're doing ePro on your own device, you've got the login and password security. So we also need to think about how do we ensure that the right person is giving that measurement or wearing that device. I think that will be a really important process to think through as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, from the tech side, it's probably not a surprising answer from someone that works at Oracle, but it's all very secure. The ability today to tokenize, to encrypt on transit, to store encrypted, to manage all of the necessary protocols to keep that data secure. I think the complexities that we run into is more to what Flo was getting at, less so kind of, is the technology actually secure? Because I mean, the amount of people wearing watches and wearing sensors and wearables, the security protocols that you put on a trial for that same data is exponentially higher than the commercial grade. And, it is unlikely that anything's going to happen there. But obviously it is a risk and it is a high concern that we keep that and maintain the updates and the encryptions and everything that's required to keep it as secure as possible.
Thank you. Another question, are there dangers of collecting continuous data 24/7? Do we have concerns about potentially having too much data that dilutes the value of the data?
Yes.
We do.
I think that again goes back to the conversation we've been having about plan. What data do you need to collect? Don't collect all of this other data that you don't need. There's that tendency, or there you can kind of think you could do that because there's so much out there and there's all these things you could do with it, but realistically, are you going to do that? And is it going to be meaningful in your trial? Think the continuous monitoring aspect, or that data coming in continuously, do you need it continuously, or can you just have it at set points in time? It can be more frequently than a site visit, but does it need to be every second of every day? And I think, yeah, again, planning, what data do you need, and go after that.
On that continuous data point, I mean, if we take something simple like a temperature, yes, you can collect the data continuously, or you can collect it point in time, but I'm assuming also, and I'm looking at you, Ryan, that from just a data management perspective, even if you do collect it continuously, that's not necessarily the way it needs to get shared or dashboard, right? You could decide that you want to statistically take an average or share it once every hour, or how do you manage that?
I mean, from my perspective, I would say that you really need to think about the windows that you're measuring in. If you're measuring all day, I mean, I had a spin class this morning. Obviously things are going to spike during that spin class. Temperature, heart rate, there's a lot of things that are going to go up. Do you want to incorporate that in your study? Do you want to hide it? Are you looking for resting heart rates? Are you looking for active heart rates? You really need to understand, because you're going to see all sorts of those. I mean, a very stressful situation at work, your heart could go up. Who knows the scenarios? So, being very clear with the patient and what you want to measure. If you want a resting heart rate, put on the device an hour before you want the measurement, wait an hour after, take an average. You need to understand how you want to evaluate the ability to collect that continuous and set those windows accordingly.
Another question, are there potential concerns with this level of data creating an issue with double-blind studies?
So I think that the same with PRO data and other data in a trial, it's who's got access to that data. So a lot of the time when ClinROs are administered in trials and they're to do with efficacy, the person that is administering them might be different from the one who is looking at the safety data, because they don't want to be unblinded to the group that the participant is in. And I think we need to think again about, you know, that's the case with any data. It's the same with wearable and sensor data, is who's looking at that data, and what are they going to do with that throughout the trial? Are they going to intervene based on that data, or is it just being used in the analysis? I think that all needs to be thought through.
Thanks, Flo. What are the panelists' opinions on a requirement of a device to be a 510K approved in order to be used in a trial?
I'll take a stab. I think the device itself being 510K approved may be a hurdle that isn't as necessary as potentially the algorithm or the measurement that you're trying to take being validated. You know, that would be more of the strategy I would look at to ensure that there's consistency, repeatability, and reliability in what you're measuring. I don't know if we necessarily need 510K approval for the gyrosphere that's measuring, you know, spins per second.
Yeah, it's comparing it to an existing standard, isn't it? But the most important thing is how that data is then going to be used. How are you bringing that data together from that device and using it as an endpoint in your trial? I think that's the important aspect.
Thanks. One last question here. Should the industry be obligated to share their data and present to the industry as a better measurement?
So from the point of view of a patient, myself, who is relying on clinical trials for treatment, I work in this industry and it drives me crazy as a patient that we just don't share things. Everyone still works in silos. We talk about sharing things, we have our collaborations, we have our global consortiums, but do we truly share experiences and data across the industry? I don't think so. And I think that everyone could do better by just thinking about what we're all doing this for. You know, we're doing all of this to get new treatments to make lives better for patients. And for me, that is the key to all of this. And I wish we would I wish we would share.
Yeah, I think we owe it to the patients and the participants who have given up their time to contribute this data to a trial, which, you know, taking part in a trial is a risk for somebody. And I think we owe it to them to then do as much as we can with that data to really drive the industry forward in terms of how we understand technology use, but also how we understand new treatments and their value and their risk. And if I'm a participant in a trial and I've given up my time and I've been willing to contribute my data, then I think, yeah, we should get better at sharing that for the greater good of the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue back to kind of taking any sort of diagnostics. Like we've set standards so we can measure improvement off of it. If every company is developing their own endpoint standard for their sensors and wearable strategy, how are you comparing one to another? The goal is to better the treatment for the patient, not consolidate or hide the way you're measuring improvement. It should be something that's publicly available and benchmarked against each opportunity for that patient to have a better treatment.
Here, here. Okay, so there's a challenge to the industry out there. We're at time. We didn't get through all the questions. We will send back the answers to the questions as a follow-up, but I want to thank all of you so much for sharing your time and your expertise.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists for that very wonderful, very insightful discussion. We have now indeed reached the end of the webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Avio Health may follow up with you. Or if you have any further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are displayed on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve on our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in your chat box, and it should be there right now. And you can use this link to view the recording of this event on that page. And you can also share that link with your colleagues so that when they register for the recording, they can also view the webinar there as well. So I do encourage you to do so. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Leslie Pascoe, Dr. Florence Molam, Dr. Helen Shaw, and Ryan Kennedy. We hope you found this webinar informative. On behalf of the team here at X-Talks, thank you very much for joining us once again. And until next time, take care and have a great day, everyone. Thank you all once again.